Between 1959 and 1961, China experienced the deadliest famine in recorded human history. It was not caused by drought. It was not caused by flood. The harvests failed in some regions, but across much of the country, food existed. The Chinese Communist Party had set grain quotas for every village and province. Local officials, afraid to report failure, submitted false numbers, inflated yields, fabricated surpluses. The central government collected grain based on those numbers. It collected grain from people who had none left. It continued to export grain to the Soviet Union throughout. Starvation spread from village to village. Peasants who tried to leave were turned back at checkpoints. Those who spoke of the famine were arrested. The state did not acknowledge it. Internal documents recorded it in detail. Between 15 and 55 million people died. This actually happened. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization. Because history demands to be remembered. The number most historians now accept is somewhere between 30 and 55 million dead. The range itself is an indictment, not of the historians, but of the system that made precise counting impossible, then made counting dangerous, then made the dead disappear into the same bureaucratic silence that had killed them. The Great Leap Forward began in 1958. Mao Zedong had been consolidating power for nearly a decade by then, and what he announced was not a policy so much as a declaration of intent. China would industrialize at a pace that would make the Soviet model look timid. Steel production would double, then double again. Agricultural collectivization, already underway since the mid-1950s, would be completed and accelerated. The commune system, vast administrative units that absorbed individual farms, villages, even family kitchens into a single state apparatus, would unlock productive forces that private ownership had suppressed. The logic was internally coherent, if you accepted the premises. The premises were wrong. What the commune system actually destroyed was the network of local knowledge that agriculture depends on. A farmer who has worked the same land for 20 years knows things that cannot be written in a central directive, which fields drain slowly after rain, which crops fail in a dry summer, how to read the particular sky above a particular valley. Collectivization did not just redistribute land, it dismantled the information infrastructure of Chinese farming, replacing it with a command structure that rewarded reporting upward over observing outward. Yield figures went up. Actual yields did not. The falsification started almost immediately, and it started for a reason that is worth understanding precisely. Local cadres faced quotas set by officials who had promised results to officials above them, all the way to Beijing, where Mao's inner circle had made commitments grounded not in agronomic reality, but in ideological ambition. A village party secretary who reported a shortfall was not just delivering bad news. He was, in the political grammar of the moment, revealing himself as an enemy of the revolution, a saboteur of the Great Leap, a man whose loyalty was suspect. The incentive structure was simple and catastrophic. Lie or be destroyed. So they lied. They reported harvests of 10,000 jin per mu, a number so disconnected from physical possibility that some officials must have known, as they wrote it, that they were drafting their own people's death warrants, because the state, receiving these numbers, calculated its grain procurement accordingly. If a commune reported a harvest of 1 million jin, the state took its share of a harvest of 1 million jin, even when the actual harvest was a fraction of that. What remained for the farmers who had grown the grain was whatever the lie left over, which was often nothing. The autumn of 1959 was when the machinery of starvation locked into place. The harvests of 1958 had already been poor, partly because of weather, partly because millions of agricultural workers had been pulled from fields to smelt steel in backyard furnaces, one of the more surreal directives of the period. The steel produced in those furnaces was largely useless, brittle pig iron that could not be used for construction or manufacturing. The crops that went unharvested because the workers were smelting rotted in the fields. But the reported figures bore no relation to this reality. so the procurement continued, and by the winter of 1959, there were villages in Sichuan, in Anhui, in Gansu, where the grain stores were empty. Anhui province is where the documented record becomes most detailed and most terrible. The province's party secretary, Zheng Xisheng, had been among the most enthusiastic reporters of inflated figures. Anhui's reported yields in 1958 were staggering, and the procurement quotas set against those figures were correspondingly staggering. When the famine arrived, Anhui's rural population had nothing left. Survivors interviewed decades later described eating bark, grass roots, the leather from shoes. They described village meetings where cadres, themselves malnourished, were required to report that the harvest had been successful. They described the specific shame of a parent watching a child starve while the official line held that China had never eaten better. Jasper Becker, Frank Dicotter, Yang Jisheng, the historians who have worked most rigorously with the surviving documents, describe scenes from the countryside that the official record of the period simply does not contain. Mass graves dug by people too weak to dig them properly. Families that lost every member within weeks. Villages where the population fell by a third, a half, more, and the survivors were too few and too depleted to plant the following spring's crop, which meant the famine extended itself into the next year. Yang Jisheng's tombstone, published in Hong Kong in 2008 and banned in mainland China, is the most comprehensive account written from inside. Yang was a journalist for Xinhua, the state news agency, which gave him access to provincial archives that would have been closed to a foreign researcher. What he found in those archives was a bureaucratic record of mass death that had been systematically concealed, not destroyed, because the local officials who kept the records were not always sure what was politically safe to do with them, so they sat in filing cabinets while the official history said nothing happened. Yang's father starved to death in Xinjiang in 1959. He spent 20 years assembling the evidence of what killed him, and the 45 million others the book estimates died alongside him. The figure Yang arrives at, 36 million dead, as his central estimate, is derived from demographic analysis of the provincial records, cross-referenced with household registration data, and the census figures that the Chinese government suppressed from 1953 until 1983. Decoders' work, drawing on additional provincial and county archives, opened partially in the post-Mao period, arrives at a minimum of 45 million excess deaths between 1958 and 1962. The range reflects genuine uncertainty about regional records, not about whether a catastrophe occurred. What makes the accounting so difficult, and what makes it so important to attempt, is that the Chinese state maintained two parallel realities throughout the famine years. In the official reality, production was surging. China was exporting grain, and it was, throughout the famine, continuing to export grain to fulfill trade commitments and to project an image of socialist success, even as the countryside starved. In 1959, China exported 4.2 million tons of grain. In 1960, when the famine was at its worst, it exported 2.7 million tons. This was not a failure of information reaching the top, Mao was told. He was told repeatedly by officials who understood what was happening in the provinces and who brought him evidence. The response to that evidence is what distinguishes the Great Leap famine from a natural disaster. In April 1959, a senior official named Peng Dehuai wrote a private letter to Mao detailing the failures of the Great Leap and calling for a correction. Peng was a decorated military commander, a man of unimpeachable revolutionary credentials. Mao read the letter, circulated it to the full Politburo as a document of rightist deviation, and had Peng denounced at the Lushan conference that summer. Peng was stripped of his positions. The lesson for every other official in China was unambiguous. Accurate reporting was political suicide. After Lushan, the procurement did not slow. It accelerated. Mao, faced with evidence that the Great Leap was failing, doubled down, in part because to admit failure would have been to admit that his ideological framework was wrong, and the entire structure of his authority rested on that framework being correct. The logic was circular and lethal. Failure could not be acknowledged because acknowledgement would delegitimize the system. So the system continued producing failure, and the people who died as a result died in a silence enforced by the state that was killing them. There is a particular cruelty in what the commune system did to the social mechanisms that might have cushioned the blow. In Chinese villages, networks of mutual aid, family obligations, informal credit, the right to glean after harvest, had for centuries provided a floor beneath which destitution could not easily fall. The commune system dissolved those networks. It collectivized not just land and labor, but community itself, replacing the horizontal obligations of neighbors and kin with the vertical obligation to the state. When the state failed to provide, there was nothing lateral left to fall back on. The county-level records that have surfaced in the decades since show something that the national-level statistics obscure. The famine was not uniform. Some counties lost 5% of their population. Others lost 30, 40%. The variation was not primarily a function of weather or soil. It was a function of local cadres, how zealously they enforced procurement, how honestly they reported to the levels above them, whether they had the courage or the influence to hold back grain for the people who had grown it. In Xinyang Prefecture, in the southern part of Henan Province, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died between 1959 and 1961. The local party secretary, Zhang Shufan, had reported extraordinary yields. Procurement teams moved through villages with armed escorts. Peasants found hiding grain were beaten, some were beaten to death. When the bodies began to accumulate, the party's response was not to release food from the state granaries, which held reserves, but to seal the roads. People trying to leave in search of food were turned back at checkpoints. The dying was to be contained geographically so that its scale would not become legible to the outside world or to the levels of the party apparatus above. This is the detail that should not be allowed to disappear into abstraction. There was grain. In some areas, while people starved, grain sat in state warehouses because releasing it would have required an official to admit, in writing, that the harvest figures he had submitted were false. The choice was between feeding people and protecting a lie, and the lie won. Not because the officials were uniformly monstrous, some of them were themselves barely eating, but because the system had structured their choices so that honesty was fatal and concealment was survival. The famine broke in the way that centralized catastrophes eventually break, not through internal correction, but through the accumulation of damage too vast to administer around. By 1961, even Beijing's own statisticians could not reconcile the demographic data. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping traveled to the countryside and saw what was there to be seen. Liu reportedly told Mao that history would judge them and the peasants would chisel their crimes into their memorial tablets. Mao pulled back. Procurement quotas were reduced. Some private plots were restored. The worst of the commune system was allowed to quietly erode. The Great Leap was not declared a failure. It was simply not discussed, allowed to recede from official language while the country tried to recover from it. The recovery was slow in ways that outlasted the famine itself. Rural communities that had lost a third of their working-age population could not simply resume normal agricultural life when the pressure lifted. Children who had been malnourished during critical developmental windows carried that damage into adulthood. The demographic hole the famine punched into certain provinces was visible in the census data for decades, cohorts simply missing, the ordinary continuity of a population interrupted and never fully repaired. Mao died in 1976. The official Chinese Communist Party verdict, issued in 1981, described the Great Leap Forward as a serious error for which Mao bore chief responsibility, but concluded that his historical contributions outweighed his mistakes, setting the ratio at 70% credit to 30% error. The famine was acknowledged as a difficult period caused by serious losses due to natural disasters, combined with errors in work. The number of dead was not specified. It has never been officially specified. In the mainland Chinese public record, those 30 to 45 million people remain, essentially, uncounted. Yang Zhisheng named his book Tombstone because his father had no grave marker. Tens of millions of the famine dead have no grave markers. The bureaucratic silence that enforced the famine during its years did not lift when the famine ended. It transformed into historical silence, which is a different instrument but serves the same function. Living people need food. Dead people need acknowledgement. The state denied both. What the Great Leap Famine reveals about power is not a new lesson, but it is a lesson that the scale of this event states with unusual clarity. An authoritarian system does not merely suppress truth when truth is inconvenient. It restructures incentives so that truth becomes undiscoverable. Local officials who might have saved lives by reporting accurately were not simply prevented from doing so by fear, though fear was real. They were embedded in a system where accurate reporting generated personal destruction and false reporting generated career advancement. And over time, after the purges of anyone who spoke clearly, the apparatus filled with people who had been selected for their willingness to say what the ideology required. The system did not need to silence individuals one by one. It cultivated a class of people for whom the silence was habitual. That is the mechanism worth understanding. Not the cruelty of individual cadres, though cruelty was present and should not be minimized. The mechanism is how a system, built around ideological certainty and vertical authority, progressively destroys its own capacity to perceive reality, and how that perceptual destruction has consequences that fall entirely on those at the bottom. The farmers, the rural poor, the people who had no voice in any of it, and whose deaths would not be acknowledged by the government that caused them. Peng Dehuai wrote a private letter and lost everything for it. Liu Shaoqi went to the countryside and saw the bodies and told Mao what he had seen, and a decade later was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution, denied medical treatment for diabetes, and died on a concrete floor in 1969. The political system that could not tolerate accurate information about the famine could not tolerate accurate information about anything. The same dynamic that starved tens of millions eventually consumed its own architects. There is something about human nature in this too, something less comfortable than the easy conclusion that power corrupts. The local cadres who enforced procurement at gunpoint while granaries held reserves were not, as a class, sadists who had been waiting for permission to harm. They were people navigating an impossible structure, many of them ideologically sincere, people who had joined the revolution because they believed in it and were now trying to be good communists in a system where being a good communist meant ignoring the starving. Ideology does not require bad people to produce atrocity. It requires ordinary people and a structure that makes atrocity the path of least resistance. The Great Leap Famine was built from that material. Sincere belief, institutional cowardice, upward loyalty, and the ancient human capacity to not see what it is dangerous to see. The specific horror of a famine, as opposed to other forms of mass death, is its duration. It does not arrive with the speed of a bombardment. It extends across seasons, giving everyone involved months in which a different choice was possible. Months in which the grain was somewhere, the knowledge of where it was existed, the physical distance between the stored grain and the dying people was sometimes a matter of miles. The suffering had length, and within that length were 10,000 moments where someone could have acted differently. That so few did is not a condemnation of Chinese human nature. It is a demonstration of how comprehensively a system can close off the space for individual moral action when it is designed, whether intentionally or by accumulated incentive, to do so. China's government does not teach this history. The archives that Yang Jisheng and Decoder accessed in the 1990s and 2000s have since been reclosed. Researchers attempting to work on the period encounter institutional obstruction that has grown more systematic, not less, in the years since Xi Jinping consolidated power. The 1981 verdict remains the official account, and the official account remains insufficient to the dead by a factor of tens of millions. Why remember this? Not to indict China, not as an exercise in ideological point scoring about communism versus capitalism, not for the comfort of locating evil at a safe historical distance. The reason to remember this precisely, with the names of provinces and the export tonnage figures and the specific fate of Peng Dehuai and the specific contents of Yang Jisheng's filing cabinets, is that the mechanisms that produced it are not unique to Mao's China. They are the mechanisms of any system that concentrates information control and political authority in the same hands, that punishes accuracy and rewards flattery, that treats ideological commitment as a more reliable guide to reality than observation. Those mechanisms are not exotic. They recur. The dead of Anhui and Xinjiang and Gansu and Sichuan were not victims of a natural disaster that overwhelmed a government's capacity to respond. They were victims of a system that encountered accurate information about mass death and treated the information as the problem. Somewhere between 30 and 55 million of them. The range is wide because the counting was made impossible, then dangerous, then unnecessary, because they were poor and rural, and in a country whose government had decided that the story of their dying did not serve the story it was trying to tell. They deserved to be counted. Counting them now, insisting on the counting, is the minimum that memory requires.